The alarm sounded at 2:37 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday. On the 12th floor of the Harval Industrial Complex in rural Missouri, 232 workers heard the same signal simultaneously. 3 long beeps, 1 short, 3 long ones again, and no one needed an explanation. It was the code for chemical contamination in the pipeline sector. The safety team had exactly 20 minutes to isolate the leak before the gas reached the central ventilation system. If it did, the 6 floors below would be evacuated with losses. The chief engineer, Harrison Stone, rushed into the control room, his shirt unbuttoned and his face pale. He looked at the panel. He looked at the technician beside him, and he said, in a voice that no one who had been in that room ever forgot, "There's nothing we can do." The problem was simple to understand and impossible to solve. The VR7 safety valve had stuck open, a manufacturing defect that preventive maintenance reports had been indicating for 14 months without a single repair order being signed. To close it manually, someone needed to enter Technical Corridor D, descend 18 meters on an iron ladder, cross the pressurization sector with the active pipelines, and turn a specific crank 90 degrees counterclockwise. It seemed simple on paper. But Corridor D was at 43 degrees, full of steam released by the leak itself, and the available protective equipment could only withstand a maximum of 8 minutes of exposure before compromising the operator's vision and motor coordination. The specialized technicians needed 15. Harrison Stone looked at the team, and the team looked back at him. Nobody moved. Then the control room door slowly opened. Outside stood a 51-year-old man, a yellow plastic bucket in his right hand and a folded rag draped over his left shoulder. His name was Arthur Davidson. Everyone there knew Arthur Davidson, the way you know a chair or a plant in the hallway. He was always there, but no one really saw him. He wore a gray uniform with the complex's emblem faded on the chest, had the calloused hands of someone who had spent his entire life carrying heavy things, and the quiet eyes of someone who observes a lot and speaks little. He stood in the doorway for 2 seconds, listening to the alarm, reading the panel with a calmness that didn't match anything happening in that room. Then he carefully placed the bucket on the floor. He folded the rag over it, and he simply said, "I know what to do." Arthur Davidson had arrived at the Harval complex 6 years earlier with a 1-page handwritten resume delivered personally to the front desk because he didn't know how to use the online registration system. The HR supervisor, Cynthia Hunter, had filed the paper in the unsuitable candidates folder without even finishing reading it. But that day the company was desperate. 3 janitors had resigned that same week, and someone needed to manage the technical floors. She called Arthur without any expectations, and he showed up the next day 10 minutes early, uniform pressed, and with a silence she interpreted as shyness. She was wrong. Arthur wasn't shy. He simply didn't see the point in speaking when there was nothing important to say. And in that complex, for the next 6 years, there almost never was. What nobody knew, what was never asked, because nobody asks a janitor anything, was what lay hidden beneath that 1-page resume. Arthur had worked for 18 years as an industrial maintenance technician at a petrochemical plant in rural Kansas. He knew pipeline systems, pressure valves, and chemical containment protocols the way you only learn by making mistakes, fixing them, and carrying the weight of each error on your body. He had participated in 2 real emergency procedures, one of which involved entering a steam corridor without full equipment because there wasn't time, and emerging with second-degree burns on his left forearm. The scar was still there, hidden by the sleeve of his gray uniform. Arthur never showed it to anyone at Harval. Nobody ever asked where it came from. The company where he had spent almost 2 decades closed its doors in 2017, a victim of a series of wrong decisions by management and an economic crisis that spared no one already at their limit. Arthur was 51 years old. with technical expertise that the market no longer recognized on paper, and a 17-year-old daughter living with him in a rented apartment in San Francisco. He tried for 2 years to find something in the field. He sent his resume to 43 companies. He received 3 responses. No interviews. The market didn't want middle-aged technicians without formal degrees, even if these technicians knew how to do things that newly graduated engineers would never dare to try. So Arthur stopped fighting the tide. He took a job as a janitor. And he went to work every day, as if the job mattered. Because for him, any job mattered. Within the Harval complex, Arthur moved through the technical floors with a freedom no one else possessed. He would enter the maintenance corridors to clean, and while cleaning, he would read the valve labels, observe the meters, and listen to the ductwork. 6 years of daily walks through those floors had built in him a mental map of the entire system, not out of obligation, not out of formal technical curiosity, but because Arthur was one of those people who can't see something without understanding it. In 2023, he had found a crack in a fitting in Corridor C and left a handwritten note for the technician in charge. The note went unanswered for 3 weeks. He left another. Someone finally came to look, and the engineer on duty said it was nothing serious. The crack was repaired 4 months later, during a mandatory inspection. No one connected the dots. Harrison Stone looked at Arthur the way someone looks at a stranger who's entered the wrong place. It was a look that didn't need words, but it said, with total clarity, that this man in the gray uniform and yellow bucket had no business being there, that the situation was too serious for symbolic gestures, that there was a hierarchy in that complex, and that it needed to be respected, even with the alarm blaring. Arthur saw that look. He'd known that look for decades. He'd received versions of it in technical meetings where he wasn't invited to give his opinion, at company receptions where resumes were returned unopened, in cafeterias where the engineers' tables were on the opposite side from the workers. He didn't move. He simply repeated, in the same calm voice as before, looking directly at the panel and nodded Harrison. "I know VR7, and I know exactly how much time I have." Harrison Stone was 36 years old, with a master's degree in chemical engineering from Harvard University and 12 framed performance awards on his office wall. He was the kind of professional who could present solutions in PowerPoint before even understanding the problem, and who confused authority with competence with a naturalness that startled those who observed him closely. At that moment, with the alarm sounding and the panel red, he was paralyzed. Not by physical fear, but by the kind of paralysis that happens when someone who has always been protected by hierarchy finally finds themselves alone facing something that hierarchy cannot solve. He looked at Arthur one more time. Then he looked at the technicians around him. Then he returned to Arthur, and he said, in a voice that tried to sound firm, but sounded only small, "You're the janitor. Stay out here." Arthur didn't answer. He turned his back to Harrison, went to the side panel of the room, opened the emergency tool compartment, and began selecting what he needed with a speed that wasn't haste. It was precision. An 18mm socket wrench, a roll of thermal tape. The portable temperature gauge hung on the left hook. As he picked up each piece, Alicia Watts, the on-duty safety technician, stared at him with an expression that oscillated between disbelief and something she couldn't yet name. She knew Arthur Davidson. He always swept the hallway near her office at 10 in the morning and had never said more than "good morning" and "excuse me." She never imagined that those hands that pushed brooms also knew how to choose emergency tools without hesitation. For God's sake, someone get this man out of here. The voice belonged to Henry Harris, the operations supervisor, who had rushed in 2 minutes after the alarm, tablet in hand, his face contorted with the pressure of knowing the incident would be recorded and assessed. He knew Arthur the same way everyone there knew him, as background noise, ambient sound. Seeing that man tampering with the emergency tools wasn't just inconvenient for Henry. It was a threat to the narrative of control he needed to maintain. If a janitor handled it, what did that say about the engineers who were standing around? Henry walked toward Arthur with the clear intention of physically blocking him. That's when Alicia stepped forward, placing her body between the two men. She herself wasn't quite sure why she had done it. The timer on the wall showed 16 minutes. Arthur was in technical corridor D before anyone could decide whether to let him through. The iron ladder creaked under his weight, and the heat rose from the metal floor as if the building itself were feverish. With each step, the temperature increased in fractions that his body registered before his mind. Arthur breathed slowly through his nose, counting mentally. He knew that the steam, at that stage of pressurization, had not yet reached the critical concentration in the lower corridor. He had, at most, 6 minutes before that changed. Any technician with standard equipment would take 15 minutes to descend, position themselves, and safely turn the crank. Arthur didn't have complete equipment. He only had what he had grabbed, the knowledge he had carried within him for decades, and the mental map of every inch of that corridor etched in 6 years of daily cleaning. In the control room, silence had swallowed everything. The alarm still sounded, but no one spoke. Harrison stood before the panel with his arms crossed, and there was something in that posture that Alicia recognized as shame disguised as authority. Henry typed on his tablet, recording the incident with the aseptic language of corporate reports. The other technicians looked at the cameras in Corridor D, where the image was blurred by steam, but a silhouette could be seen descending with slow, steady steps. Someone murmured, "He's going to die in there." No one answered, not because they thought the comment was wrong, but because part of that silence was the acknowledgement that they had let a 51-year-old janitor into a steam corridor while they stood by and watched. On the 12th step, Arthur felt the temperature reach something close to 48 degrees. The thermal tape he had wrapped around his wrists was doing its job, but his face was exposed. He lowered his head, let his chin touch his chest, and continued down. Each movement was calibrated, without visible urgency, without hesitation, without the kind of rush that burns time and energy when the environment is already costing you both. On the 18th step, his feet touched the lower floor, and the heat here was different, denser, like entering a mouth. He stopped, closed his eyes for 2 seconds, breathed, then opened them. In front of him, about 8 meters away, was the VR7's crank, exactly where he knew it would be, exactly the size he remembered, exactly the rust color he had noticed months ago during routine cleaning and mentally registered without anyone asking. In the control room, Alicia was the first to notice what was happening on the blood pressure monitor. The number was rising faster than the calculations predicted. This meant the window of time had shrunk. Arthur didn't have 6 minutes. He had 4 at most. She opened the internal communication with Runner D and said the number aloud in the controlled voice of someone who knows that panic is useless but still feels her heart racing. On the other end, there was no verbal response, only the sound of quickening footsteps, not a frantic run, but something between walking and running. The pace of someone who increased their speed without relinquishing control. Harrison looked at the monitor. He looked at the camera. And for the first time that day, he was completely quiet. The steam began to thicken in the lower corridor chamber at 2:51 p.m. The image turned to white fog, and for 42 seconds, no one in the control room could see anything. Henry stopped typing.
Harrison uncrossed his arms. Alicia placed her hand on the radio without pressing any buttons, because there was nothing to say, and she knew it. The alarm continued to sound. The pressure gauge continued to rise. And then, without warning, without a sonic climax, without the kind of drama that movies promise, the number on the panel stopped. It stood still for a second. 2. And it began to fall.
Slowly at first, then with the consistency of someone releasing what had been held back. The VR7 valve was closed. Down there, in the steam-filled corridor, someone had done the impossible before any of the experts present could decide if it was possible. Arthur climbed the iron staircase with the same rhythm he had descended. Controlled, paused, one step at a time. When he reached the top and pushed open the door to Corridor D, the steam that escaped with him was visible on the other side of the control room's glass. Alicia was the first to reach the door. She found him standing in the corridor, leaning against the concrete wall with his eyes closed, breathing deeply. His face was red. The right sleeve of his uniform had a dark stain where the steam had concentrated heat. He was holding the cannon key with both hands over his abdomen, like someone who had finished something and still didn't have a place to land. Alicia said his name. He opened his eyes, and what she saw there wasn't exhaustion. It was the specific expression of someone who had done what needed to be done and didn't need applause to know it. Inside the control room, Arthur's arrival created a silence unlike any other. The first silence had been one of fear. This one was the silence of the bill arriving. Harrison stood near the panel, and when Arthur entered, the two stared at each other for a moment that no one in the room dared interrupt. There was no visible gratitude on Harrison's face. There was something harder to bear, the recognition that a man he had told to stay out had entered, descended 18 meters, closed a valve in 4 minutes inside a steam corridor, and walked back. Henry Harris looked at the tablet in his hand and realized that the report he was typing would need to be completely rewritten, because the version he had started didn't have room for what had just happened. It was Alicia who broke the silence. She turned to Harrison and said, in a voice that wasn't accusatory but wasn't gentle either, "Did you know he'd worked in petrochemicals?" Harrison didn't answer. She asked again, this time to the whole room. "Did anyone here know?" No one spoke. Arthur placed the socket wrench on the tool table with a metallic sound that echoed louder than it should have. Then he looked at Alicia and said, without bitterness, without irony, with the direct clarity of someone who had spent too long waiting for someone to ask the right question. No one asked. 3 words, 2 seconds, and their weight hung in the air of that room like smoke after a fire, visible, real, and impossible to pretend wasn't there. The official incident report was filed 48 hours later. Henry Harris had written a version that described the resolution of the leak as a joint action by the technical security team, without mentioning any name, position, or specific circumstance. It was the kind of language that erases what is inconvenient without needing to lie directly. It simply omits the whole truth. Alicia received the document by email, read it twice, and sat in front of the computer for an amount of time she couldn't even measure. Then she printed the report, took a red pen, and circled each passage that erased Arthur. There were 7 passages. She photographed each page, and she forwarded everything, with a 3-line message without any embellishment, to the Operational Security Management, to the Internal Compliance Council, and to the journalist who had published an investigation into covered-up accidents in the São Paulo industrial sector 6 months earlier. The response was swift. Operations Director Raymond Graves called an emergency meeting for the following morning with Harrison, Henry, Alicia, and the 2 maintenance coordinators whose signatures were missing from the VR7 repair orders, the same orders that had been flagged for 14 months, being required to attend. What began as a damage control attempt quickly turned into something else when Raymond realized Alicia had arrived at the meeting with printed copies of every ignored preventive maintenance report, every unanswered email, every note Arthur had left about the crack in Corridor C 2 years earlier. The stack of papers on the table was thin, but it weighed heavily as evidence. Harrison stared at it throughout the meeting without uttering a word of any real significance. Arthur was called into Raymond Graves' office that same afternoon. He arrived in his work uniform, as it was his shift, and he hadn't asked to be excused. Raymond greeted him standing, which was unusual, and began to talk about recognition, about procedures that needed reviewing, about the importance of valuing internal knowledge. Arthur listened with the same calm attention he displayed with anything else. When Raymond finished and asked if Arthur had anything to say, he was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said he had a request. Raymond opened his hands, receptive. Arthur said he wanted the VR7 repair order to be used as a case study in internal safety training. Not to embarrass anyone, but so that the mistake would at least serve the purpose of preventing its recurrence. Raymond agreed before he finished hearing the sentence. What followed was swift and public in a way no one had planned. The journalist published the story in 4 days. The headline didn't mention Arthur by name at first. It talked about systemic maintenance failures in Missouri's industrial sector. But the account of the incident was there, with details that could only come from someone who had been in the control room. The story of an 18-year experienced technician working as a janitor because the market had no room for him, who had solved in 4 minutes what an entire team couldn't even begin to tackle, spread across social media with the specific speed of stories that touch on something people recognize but never knew how to name. The comments weren't about industrial technology. They were about invisibility, about what is lost when you stop asking who the person on the other side of the uniform is. Henry Harris requested a department transfer 2 weeks later. Harrison was temporarily removed while an internal audit reviewed the maintenance protocols under his supervision. An audit that, according to internal sources, had found 3 other critical repair orders shelved in addition to VR7. Alicia Watts was promoted to Operational Safety Coordinator, a position that had been vacant for 8 months due to a lack of a candidate with the right profile. And Arthur Davidson received a formal job offer as a senior industrial maintenance technician, with a salary 3 times higher than his current one and direct access to the safety committee. He asked for 2 days to think it over, not because he was hesitant, but because he was the kind of man who doesn't sign anything before reading every line, and because after decades of being treated as invisible, there was something profoundly fair in making the world wait a little for him. Arthur signed the contract one Thursday morning, sitting in the same plastic chair in the reception area where he had waited 6 years earlier with his handwritten resume. He didn't ask for a different room. He didn't ask for a ceremony. He signed, returned the pen, thanked them with a nod, and went to work, because it was his shift. And because for Arthur, work had always been the most honest answer he knew how to give to the world. But that day, when he walked down Technical Corridor D for his first official inspection with his new badge, something had changed in the way the space received him. The doors were open. The technicians stopped to talk. Not with the empty politeness of someone following protocol, but with the specific respect of someone who had seen something they could no longer pretend not to have seen. The scar on Arthur's left forearm first appeared in public during a training session he himself led on the VR7 case, 3 weeks later. He had rolled up his sleeve to show the group the portable temperature gauge, and the old burn mark was visible for a few seconds before he lowered the fabric back down. No one commented at the time, but after the session, a young technician of 23 approached and asked, with a seriousness that sounded older than his years, where that scar came from. Arthur looked at the young man for a moment. Then he told the story. Not the summarized version, not the version that spares details so as not to bother anyone. The whole story, with the corridor, the heat, the decision made in seconds, and what one learns when a mistake has physical weight and is marked on the skin forever. On the last day of the month, Arthur went to the complex's reception and handed over his folded gray uniform with the same care he had shown every day of work for the previous 6 years. The faded emblem on his chest was a little more worn than he had realized. He ran his thumb over it once, slowly, like closing an account that had been open for too long. Outside, the Missouri sun beat down on the asphalt with the usual brutality of a March afternoon, and the street traffic continued as usual, indifferent, constant, unaware that a man had just crossed an invisible border that had taken decades to reach. Arthur placed the uniform on the counter. He turned his back. And he left through the same door he had entered 6 years ago, only this time the world on the other side was slightly different, because he had refused to be just what they let him be. If this story made you think of someone you know, someone who carries more than they seem, who knows more than they were asked, then you already understand why stories like this need to be told. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. There's a new one every week.